The first superpowers didn't conquer land, they controlled routes. The world's first superpowers weren't built by taking the most land. They were built by controlling the routes that everything had to pass through. And once you see history through that lens, the whole story of power starts looking different. Because most people think the strongest civilizations were the ones with the biggest armies and the most territory. But long before modern nations even existed, some of the most powerful societies in the world rose for a simpler reason. They controlled movement. They controlled access. They controlled the choke points that trade could not avoid. And if you controlled the route, you didn't need to own every city. You could still profit from every shipment, every merchant, and every deal passing through. That is how early superpower influence really worked. Welcome to FrameHistoro, where we break down the hidden systems behind history, not just battles and kings, but the real engines of power. And today, we're going to explore how trade routes created the first true superpowers, why controlling movement became more valuable than controlling land, and what this teaches us about power even today. Now imagine the ancient world like a giant marketplace. No airplanes, no internet, no container ships, and no easy travel. Everything valuable had to move slowly, by foot, by camel, by cart, or by ship. And that meant trade depended on a few key paths: narrow passages, safe harbors, river systems, and desert corridors. And if you could control those, you could shape the economy of entire regions. Not because you owned everything, but because everything had to come through you. And that's the secret. Early superpowers were often built on positioning, not size. The first big trade-based superpowers formed around rivers, because rivers were the original highways. Mesopotamia grew between the Tigris and Euphrates. Egypt grew along the Nile, and these weren't just farming lifelines. They were transport systems, moving food, building materials, and goods between cities. And once you can move goods reliably, you can collect taxes, build storage, grow markets, and support armies, because armies don't run on courage. They run on supply, and a civilization that controls supply routes can scale faster than one that doesn't. But as the world opened up, trade began stretching far beyond rivers. It turned into long-distance networks, and that's when routes became power. One of the most famous examples is the Silk Road. But the Silk Road wasn't a single road. It was a huge network of connected paths across Asia, linking China, Central Asia, the Middle East, and parts of Europe. And the real power wasn't always held by the far ends. It was often held by the societies in the middle, the ones controlling the connections, the passes, the safe stops, and the protection. Because if you were a merchant carrying silk, spices, metals, glass, or textiles, you needed safe passage, you needed rest points, you needed guards, and you needed permission. And that meant the civilizations along these routes could charge for access, collect tolls, tax trade, and grow rich without conquering massive land. And here's the important part: trade routes don't just move products, they move ideas, religion, science, language, and technology. So a civilization controlling trade routes wasn't just getting rich, it was becoming connected. And connected societies learn faster, adapt faster, and grow stronger. That is why trade route power often looks like a quiet superpower. It doesn't always scream dominance, it simply builds influence. Now, one of the earliest route control powers people forget about is the Phoenicians. They didn't build a giant land empire like Rome. Instead, they built a network of ports and trading cities across the Mediterranean. Places like Tyre, Sidon, and later Carthage. And the Phoenicians understood something ahead of their time. Controlling the sea is like controlling the internet of the ancient world. Because the sea connected economies faster than land travel. Ships could carry huge loads compared to carts. And once you master shipbuilding, navigation, and port trade, you can reach markets everywhere and make money without owning everything in between. The Phoenicians spread goods, networks, and influence, and their trade knowledge shaped the Mediterranean for centuries. Then came Carthage, a trade powerhouse built from Phoenician roots. Carthage grew rich through sea trade, controlled key ports, and dominated parts of the Western Mediterranean. And Carthage shows how trade power can become military power, because when you get rich from routes, you can afford fleets, mercenaries, and defenses, and soon you become strong enough to rival land empires, until Rome eventually crushed Carthage. But even that war proves the point. Rome fought Carthage because controlling Mediterranean trade meant controlling wealth, and controlling wealth meant controlling the future. Now, let's shift east again, because trade superpowers weren't only in Europe and the Mediterranean. The Persian Empire is a great example of a land-based power that understood route control. Persia didn't just conquer territory, it built systems to move goods and information fast. One of its greatest tools was the Royal Road, a long route that helped connect the empire and support trade. And when you can move messages quickly, move supplies quickly, and keep trade safe, you can manage huge regions more easily. And that is how Persia held such a large space together for so long. Routes create control, control creates stability, and stability attracts even more trade, because merchants always prefer safe paths. Now here's a key rule: trade follows stability, and stability follows protection. When a region becomes safe, trade increases, wealth increases, and the civilization grows stronger. But if a route becomes dangerous, trade shifts away, money stops flowing, and the power fades. That's why controlling routes was often more valuable than controlling land, because land without trade is limited, but trade without massive land can still build wealth and influence. Now, let's talk about one of the most powerful trade route systems ever created: the Indian Ocean Trade Network. Long before modern global shipping, the Indian Ocean connected East Africa, the Middle East, India, and Southeast Asia, and later touched China too. Sailors learned monsoon wind patterns, which made travel more predictable, and this created a huge moving economy of goods like spices, textiles, gold, and ceramics. And cities that controlled these ports became rich and influential. You didn't have to conquer huge regions. You just needed to be the place where ships had to stop. This is how some coastal city-states and trading hubs became powerful far beyond their size. Because trade power scales. Once a city becomes important for trade, more merchants come, more money flows, more services develop, and influence grows. And over time, that wealth can fund armies and politics. And this pattern repeats again and again. Control the port, control the wealth, then control the region around it. Now, let's bring this into the early superpower era that feels more familiar. The rise of European sea empires. Portugal and Spain were among the first to push into global ocean routes, not because they were the biggest countries, but because they wanted to control access to spices, gold, and Asian trade. They realized that whoever controlled the sea lanes could skip the middlemen and make massive profits. Portugal built trading forts and ports along Africa and into the Indian Ocean. Spain built a global connection through the Americas. And then later, the Dutch took this to a new level. The Dutch didn't just fight wars. They built a trade system, modern finance, and global shipping control. Amsterdam became a major trade and money center, and the Dutch East India Company became a giant power tool, not just a business, but a force with ships, soldiers, and control over trade routes. And once again, we see the same truth. Money follows routes, and power follows money. And Britain mastered this better than almost anyone. Britain didn't need to conquer every place directly. It needed to control trade lanes, choke points, and naval dominance. And once Britain controlled key routes and ports, it could influence global trade for generations. Because trade routes don't just move products, they move wealth. And if you control that movement, you can shape economies far away, even without ruling them directly. And here's the hidden trick that made route control so powerful. It creates dependence. Once people rely on your route, your port, your protection, and your markets, they start needing you. And once they need you, you gain leverage. And leverage is a quiet kind of power. It doesn't always look like conquest, but it can be just as controlling. And this is why trade route control created the first superpowers. because roots let you earn money without constant war. They let you influence far beyond your borders. They let you build alliances, fund fleets, and stay connected to innovation. And that also explains why trade superpowers often collapse when roots shift. Because roots are not permanent. New technology changes paths. New ships change distances. Wars disrupt safety, and new competitors build alternatives. When trade moves away, wealth moves away, and when wealth moves away, power fades. Just like that. Now, let's connect this to something simple for us audience. Controlling trade routes back then is like controlling major supply chains today, or controlling the key platforms where business happens. If you control the system everyone depends on, you don't need to own everything, you just benefit from everything. And that is why root power is so powerful. It's not about owning the most. It's about positioning yourself where the world has to pass through you. And here's a final question to reflect on. If the first superpowers weren't built by conquering land, but by controlling roots, what does that say about power today? Is the real power still about size? Or is it about control of movement, access, and connection? Because history keeps whispering the same answer. The first superpowers didn't conquer the most land. They controlled the routes that everything had to pass through. If you enjoyed this breakdown, subscribe and explore more stories on FrameHistoro. Because once you understand how trade built power, you start seeing the modern world with sharper eyes. Thanks for watching.